got a great film to play, just
hello? Have you ever snubbed a lady?
we had a technical problem.
Are we on?
Yeah, we're on there.
Can I swear? Shit!
Oh, yeah.
Welcome to Crunch and Roll. I'm John Fox. Did breakfast shows across the UK. More recently, a little bit of work for the BBC. Right, zip up your anorak. Fill your favourite radio station mug with your favourite tipple and make yourself comfortable. This is a real radio deep cut. Now, Paul Carrington has had the kind of career that most of us could only dream of. He's presented, produced and managed. He's worked with some of radio's biggest names before they weren't even small names. And also, he's a thoroughly top man as well. So over the next nearly 2 hours, he takes us through 4 decades of his career, from the early days working with Timmy Mallett on Piccadilly, some anti-commercial radio snobbery he encountered at the BBC, and also how he helped George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley escape an overexcited mob of teenage girls. Now, before we start, just a quick reminder that if you do enjoy the podcast and you are a regular listener, we'd be eternally grateful if you could support us on Ko-fi. Just go to ko-fi.com/crunch and roll. And I'll just say thank you to everybody that's supported us so far, including Adam Fitch and Matt Foister as well. Hello to you, mate. So, it's a long one, but get comfortable, get that tipple ready, because it is wonderful right through to the end. And of course, there's a little bit of strong language. So let's crunch and roll.
Oh, yeah.
Paul, how are you?
Hello, John. Oh, I thought I was expecting an introduction there.
No. We'll edit that in at the end. That's how we roll. We were just talking before we hit record that we haven't physically seen each other for... It must be nearly 20 years.
It'd be 20 years, John, since you and Tom were doing a wonderful breakfast show on Viking FM back in the early noughties. So, yeah, it must be 20 years. You've not changed. You're still wearing the same clothes.
I often thought, because of course, and we'll get onto Magic 1161 later on, but I often thought, because of course, Tom and I were two young, stupid lads, and you were this. I mean, we called you the Professor because you had such pedigree as a broadcaster. Did you think that myself and Tom were just absolute idiots?
Not at all. No. I thought that you were great, and I'm just trying to get the chronology, the chronology of where you were relative to, say, JK and Joel and Hursty and Danny. And were you in the middle, or did you come after that?
No, we were after Hursty and Danny. So JK and Joel, then Hursty and Danny, and of course Darren Leatham. We have to mention Darren, so he's very upset. and then it was myself and Tom as well, with our producer Simon Green, who's one of my greatest. friends.
Dear Simon, yes, the wonderful.
And also not just one of my greatest friends, but your biggest fan ever. You are his ultimate radio presenter.
You see, I'm not sure why that is. And, when you, as so many people have pointed out, doing this little sort of thing with you, it's normally the other way around. We as presenters are normally interviewing other people. And so it's really strange to be, to have the tables turned. And, Simon got in touch with me a few years before I think I started at Viking. And I think he mentioned that he used to listen to what I was doing on Piccadilly radio. And it's only, I was just thinking before we came on, and, you'd have anything, well, what the hell am I going to talk about? It's over 40 years since I started.
Wow.
And I've had to write down the radio stations that I've worked for. And, John, there's 17 here.
Wow.
So hence me asking, where were you in the timeline of my seeming? It looks like I can't hold down a job for more than 2 minutes, which I think is probably, quite true.
Well, let's just go right back to the start. And as always on this podcast, Crunch and Roll, we openly admit that our research is limited. So please forgive me if I haven't got the same 17 that you have. But where are you from, Paul?
I was born in Oldham. So I'm from Oldham, across the Pennines, and of course spent a great deal of my broadcast life in Yorkshire. So I did try to keep the fact that I was from the other side, quite quiet. But being from a little place called Shaw, which is on the border of West Yorkshire, the Lancashire, West Yorkshire border, I kind of, sort of tried to suggest that I was more Yorkshire than Lancashire, just to be, to be accepted, really. So yeah, I was born in Oldham General Hospital, which was the place where the first test tube baby, Louise Brown, was born. So there you are. That's my claim to fame.
Look at that. There we go. Straight in there with a
useless piece of fact.
So I mean, when did because I mean, I'm right in thinking that you started with mobile discos, didn't you, to start?
Yes. Now, like most people of my kind of vintage, I used to do loads of mobile disco. So I built all my own gear back in. What would I be? So say 1977, 78. I was cobbling together old record players, and trying to build my own gear and to do mobile discos. And I think I did my first one in 78, so I'd be 13, 14 years old. And of course, back in those days when you did mobile discos, today you have the laptop and that's it, really. You plug into someone else's sound system, hey, away you go. But back in my day, you'd have crates of records, and you needed to have muscles of Hercules to carry these things up and down fire escapes and the disco decks. I remember carrying this thing in, and someone thought I was carrying in a coffin, and they blessed it. Such was the size of the bloody thing. But so yeah, that was those were my mobile disco days. Doing sort of weddings and 21st pub gigs, that kind of thing. Now, because I was 13, 14, you might think, well, how the hell did you get in licensed premises? Well, I tried to grow a beard. And, I'd only started shaving at 13 to make myself look older, just to get in pubs to do these gigs. And, it kind of worked. No one ever questioned my age. They don't even question my age now. I can get on the bus for free, which is rather upsetting because I've yet to reach the age of a bus pass.
So when did the passion for radio start? Was it always there, or was it just the obvious move to go from mobile discos into radio?
No, it was always there, and I remember my nana. She had this great big old valve radio, the kind of thing that obviously you'd see in a museum now, but it would have been. I remember watching the Waltons, the TV program, the Waltons, and John Boy had this. The family had this great big valve radio, and I thought, "What the hell is that?" And my nana said, "I've got one like that. It's in the cupboard." So she got it out, plugged it in. Of course, this all the lights, lit up on this thing, and it took about 5-10 minutes to warm up, and coming in there were all these different radio stations. So this would be back in the early 1970s. And I was just fascinated, these different voices and everything coming from this box. So she gave me this thing, and it was one of my treasured possessions until it burst into flames a few years later. Because this thing's like from 1937.
So what kind of people were you listening to that you admired when you were young?
Well, see, I would have started listening to the radio before commercial radio began in the UK. So, say the early 1970s. So, let me see. It would be. I remember buying a little. My mum bought me a little transistor radio, which is say the size of an iPhone, and it had a tiny little speaker in it. And I remember listening to Johnny Walker on there doing Pop the Question, Tony Blackburn, and all those people from Radio 1. And so I was kind of hooked on Radio 1. And I remember hearing Kenny Everett and who else would have been around at the time. Noel Edmonds was a huge influence on me. In almost those days of Radio 1, say the mid-1970s, that would have been, my the thing that sort of got me interested and got me, if you like, into radio, because I was thinking, this sounds like a great way to make a living. This, just dicking about on the radio playing records.
Well, I mean, I did, because you are the professor, I felt that I should do some more research than normal for this episode. And I know that your first job in radio was at Piccadilly, which of course was a legendary station. And I know that your first actual radio job was really interesting, wasn't it? Because it was something to do with tarmackers and stairs. Is that right?
Well, it is. That was my first paid for job. So prior to that, my road into Piccadilly radio was like, I suppose, everyone else's. You're bombarding Piccadilly would be my local radio station, so I'd be bombarding the program director, who was a wonderful guy called Tony Ingham at the time, and just getting the usual rejection letters, nothing going, keep in touch, we'll put your details on file. Yeah, like, of course you are. But I was very persistent, and I didn't give up, and I was sending off. I used to make. I'd built Radio Bedroom. So I'd done the disco, the twin decks and everything, and I built Radio Bedroom, and I'd practice being a disc jockey in Radio Bedroom and recording these things and sending them off to Piccadilly, getting the usual rejection. When eventually, I think it was the back end of 82, 83, Timmy Mallett started on Piccadilly. And Timmy was doing the evening show, which was aimed at kids, teenagers, sort of hits, not homework type of thing. And I'd spoken to Tony's secretary and finally got an invite to go in and have a chat. And I made a complete arse of it. Because the first question that Tony asked me says, so who's your favorite radio presenter? And I said, Noel Edmonds. He said, no, I meant on Piccadilly. I said, well, I don't listen. I never listened. He said, you're serious? I said, yeah. He said, you've got a bloody cheek, haven't you, coming in here asking me for a job and you've never even heard the radio station? Which, I mean, he had a point, really, didn't he? Yes. But, my careers officer always said, tell the truth. What a load of bollocks. You just lie through your back teeth. That's the way to get on, isn't it, really? So he said, go away, listen to the radio station. Do me another take in the style of what we do. So I did. And luckily this time, I hadn't burnt my bridge in the way that I thought I might have done. And on this occasion, he said, pop in, we've got something that you might be interested in. So Timmy had been on air, I think, for a few months. And already with Timmy was a fella called Andy Bird, who was a wonderful lad. And he was my introduction to Piccadilly. And Andy later went on to be the chief executive of Disney in America. Chris Evans, I don't think had started at this point. I think Chris and I started more or less the same time. But there's one or two other people there who were basically just Timmy helpers. We were dog's bodies. We were answering telephone calls, making tea, the usual thing. And so Tony offered me, this, and it was, unpaid. I don't think we might have got a bus fare or something like that, but, totally unpaid. But to come back to your point about the first paid for role, because I got my foot in the door, and I was, dead keen, as you can imagine. I was doing I had a full-time job at this stage in electronic engineering, where I was doing my apprenticeship. So I'd do this from sort of the start time for that was 7:30 in the morning, and I'd finish at 4 or 5 o'clock and drive down to Piccadilly and be with Timmy till sort of 10 o'clock. Mess about in the off-air studio till God knows what time in the morning, then get home and, says this is how I kind of, if you like, did my training, for want of a better word. But because I got my foot in the door, Tony Ingham said to me, I've got a little job that you might be interested in. I said, oh, yes. I said, and I can pay you for this. And of course, my eyes lit up thinking, wow, the breakfast show, mid-mornings, afternoon drive. He said, we're having the roof retarmacked. Just to get this in perspective, when the roof of Piccadilly Radio was the car park for the Hotel Piccadilly, and you would access the roof from ground level, obviously, and there's a ramp that went up, and then you park the car and go into the hotel, and then down the escalator into Piccadilly Radio. So they were having the roof retarmacked, and because of this work, it would be obviously very noisy with pneumatic drills and everything. And so my first job was to keep an eye open on what was going on. The news operation had to come from the studios because it was just too big to uproot and relocate to the hotel across the road where all the programs were coming from. So all the programs came from the Britannia Hotel. They got a couple of rooms there, with mock-up studios and offices and things like that. So just before the news would start on the hour, I'd have to run up the escalator with my whistle, my little transistor radio that Tony Ingham had given to me. And I'd say to the lads who were drilling away, I said, right, lads, it's nearly 4:00. You're going to have to stop drilling now for 5 minutes whilst the news is on. And so I'd sit there, the radio, listening to the news. And then the news would say, Piccadilly News, it's 4:05. Da, 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 da. And then I'd say, right, lads, you can carry on now. So that was my first paid-for job at Piccadilly back in whatever it was, 83, 84.
I've got to ask, what was it like? What was it like working with Timmy Mallett?
Timmy, I adore. I was absolutely terrified of him, I'll be honest with you. And I think most people who worked with him were, because he was such a tough taskmaster. And, rightly so, because, it was good training, and it gave me, and I'm sure Chris and Andy, that understanding of radio. And, it was serious fun, if you understand what I mean. You're messing about, and it had to come across as entertainment, but, it had to be done right. And I just remember 2 or 3 of us maybe in master control where the phones were. So we'd take the phone calls and put them through to Timmy. But I just remember him buzzing on talkback saying, I want to call her now! And, that's how he would talk to us. So, he ran a very tight ship. And, bear in mind, what would I be, 17 maybe? So the people of, my kind of age, I think Professor Brain Cox was around as well. The guy who was in D-Ream.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Who said, aren't stars brilliant? They're like little holes in sky, but they're not the stars. So, yeah, and Brian was one of the crew as well. And Nick Robinson, who was, or who is, I think, still on BBC television, I think is their political reporter. So there's quite an illustrious company there, and of course Chris Evans. I don't know what happened to him. I'm sure I always thought he'd do well. So yeah, that was my time with Timmy doing the evening show, and I would be the one who did all the little jingles, because I wasn't very confident going on air. Chris was brilliant. He used to do a character called Nobby No Level. And, the kids loved that. And Timmy and Chris bounced off each other really well. Chris was fabulous in that he was, so quick-witted, very creative, could, come up with all these scenarios and things. I was never any good at anything like that. But what I could do was more the technical stuff. And I used to write and record these little jingles. And I remember one to the tune of Top Cat, the Top Cat theme.
Yeah, yeah.
And I revoiced it as Top Prat. So, because Timmy had all these, he was the cosmic pimple. And I can't remember the other sort of names that he used to have, but they were all kind of self-deprecating. So the Top Prat sort of fitted in well with his on-air persona. And I remember Tony Ingham pulling me up one day and says, "Is that you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I like that. It's very good."
We're having a party. Oh, yeah.
This is where I kind of get lost. So obviously you went on to do, but you obviously went on to do your own program on Piccadilly. But you didn't. Did you go to Metro before you did that?
My God, you have done your research, haven't you?
I've done a little bit. Yeah, you're the professor. I wasn't going to mess this one up, Paul.
Jesus. Because I've had to write that down because I actually forgot that. So from working with Timmy, again, it's having your foot in the door at the right time when something permanent comes up. Because I couldn't really consider my job as a chief in charge of tarmac as a permanent job, because that's just a temporary thing. So, but because I got my foot in and sort of mingling with the right people, a vacancy came up in commercial production. And that's appealed to me because of the sort of production element. I've always, been more of a producer rather than a presenter. I never really had the confidence to be a presenter. As I suppose, like a lot of people in radio, I was, quite shy, but I was comfortable doing all the production and things. So a gig came up in commercial production, but it was also as a copywriter. So you're a copywriter and a producer as well. So I did that, but then I did have this sort of, interest in being on air, because back when I was doing the mobile discos, people would be saying, "Oh yes, you're very good. You should be on the radio." And of course, they're all pissed and three sheets to the wind. And but as a kid, you think, "Oh, they mean it." You don't think anything. I must be very good. Well, of course, it wasn't. Absolutely crap. As Tony regularly reminded me when I'd do more tapes and things. But so I was at Piccadilly in commercial production, and then I saw an ad in the radio magazine. The radio magazine, do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yes, dear old Howard Rose. And they were looking for presenters up at Metro. And I did this tape and I sent it off to Giles Squire. And to my absolute amazement, he called and said, "We'd like you to come up and do a live audition." Live audition? What do you mean I do it in the studio? I said, no, you're actually on air doing an overnight show. So, of course, I'm thinking, oh, my God, no. Absolutely crapping myself. Now, at the time, I was into all these, as I say, the production element, and I tried to incorporate lots of produce things like characters and jingles and stuff into the show. And I'd scripted every single flipping link, and of course, I'd prepared it too well. It was to the nth degree. And I got up there, up to Metro, it's Longridge, Swalwell, into the studios, and I remember the first person I met was Nicky Brown. Who was a nice lad. He was doing the evening show. And I was on air at, I think it was 1 or 2 in the morning. So it was obviously the overnight show for 4 hours. And I went on. I was absolutely shaking like a leaf, the heart going 10 to the dozen, the mouth all dry, and, just that sort of out of the body surreal moment where, you just want it all to end. And I remember, playing the first record, which I think was the Bee Gees and Staying Alive. And then I did my first link, and it just was awful. I was tripping over my words, I was stumbling, and then I was, getting all hot and bothered. The things that I prepared on tape and cart, I timed it to the nth degree, and when it was 30 seconds out, oh my God. It was like a snowball effect of everything going wrong. The show at Metro was crap. Basically, it was awful, and the worst 4 hours of radio. And what used to happen was Metro would you do this 4-hour gig as a live audition. They'd put you up in a hotel. You go into the radio station the day after, and you'd have basically the snoop, the result. And I met Giles with Mick Johnson, who was the bigwig there. Mick was a very interesting man. And they both sat me down, and they said, "Well, what did you think? How did it go?" And I said, "Well, I don't think it went very well." I went, "No, it's. I think you got a bit carried away there, didn't you?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, never mind. Thanks for coming anyway. Good luck." And that was it.
Wow, really?
So I went back to Piccadilly and carried on in commercial production until I think I kind of got the bug in a sort of, I don't know, strange sense in that I thought, well, I did this, I arsed it up, but it would be nice to have another go and do it, to see if I could do it right. And I think Mike Briscoe had taken over as program controller at some stage in the mid 1980s at Piccadilly. And again, I was pestering him to do programs. They put me on overnights just to do one show to see how it went. And I think it went better. It wasn't very good. If I listen to it now, I know it would be absolutely awful. But I kind of try to keep the same elements. Now, what you have to bear in mind is back in those days, we were restricted as to the number of songs that we could play on overnight programming, and it was called needle time restriction, all to do with the musicians' union and the number of I think we were allowed something like 18 hours a day, and so the off-peak programs, the overnight shows, would be the ones that would if you like, suffer. But I remember people like Howard Jones was one of the overnight musicians, so we'd have live music. We'd have some pre-recorded music from people who'd done sessions. We'd have what was called library music. People like Frank Chaxfield and the orchestra playing, the hits of the day. I mean, it's awful. But we were allowed one needle time record an hour. So what you used to have to do is to try and come up with all these different ways, these ideas to entertain the listeners. And so that was a good training ground because it made you had to be creative. You had to come up with all these different things to do. And I remember this is where I would have started the Witchfinder General stories, the ghost stories that became popular later on at both Piccadilly and Signal. And I'd have all sorts of guests in. We'd have regression, we'd have hypnosis. We'd have the Piccadilly Witch Doctor, who was Commander Tony Gray. All these madcap characters that I used to have. And, lots of quizzes, just so you've got something to do for 4 hours. So I was doing that overnight show in addition to doing a full day in commercial production. Now, at this stage, wow. I was only doing one a week, because I was keen and green. I'd be doing a few other overnight shifts as well. And I remember in the commercial production studio, which was Studio 3 at Piccadilly, I'd put the 4 guest chairs together to form a bed. And so I'd do the overnight show, Night Beat it was called, and until 5 a.m, grab a few hours kip in the studio by sleeping on these chairs. And then getting up at sort of 7, jumping in the shower, and then doing a full day's work at Piccadilly in commercial production from 8 o'clock.
That is incredible, Paul.
It was, but then I remember when I'd done the overnights, and then there's a wonderful guy called Paul Lockett, who is still broadcasting to this day. Paul was was the longest serving member at Piccadilly. Paul used to do an absolutely brilliant early morning program, 5 till 7. So breakfast would be 7 till 9 or 10 in those days. But the early show, Paul did brilliantly. And he went on a holiday and they asked me to cover. So, I remember getting up at 3:30 in the bloody morning to come and do this. And feeling like absolute crap, because my stomach was all, body clock was all over the place. Did the early show. And then I did the traffic and travel on the breakfast show, and then a full day in commercial production. Fortunately, this wasn't a regular thing. This was maybe just for a week or two here and there. But, it's all good fun.
So when did you go from overnights to, because you then moved on, was it to late or evenings?
Yeah, so after my spell in commercial production, there was a vacancy in the production department. When I say production, perhaps I should say producers department, because each show back in those days had its own producer. So I applied for a producer's job, and I got it. This was with Mike Briscoe. Yes, Mike was the program director at this time. And it was kind of like I was the weekend show sequence producer, which sounded like one of these head of paperclip type titles, wasn't it? But also I did a magazine program on a Friday night between 6 and 8, which, I was so out of my depth with that because, I wasn't a sort of journalist stroke features presenter. I was just this person who, if I was on air, it would be just, messing about in the middle of the night. So I wasn't terribly good at this. But then come 1988, I think it was, and I think this is just before, it might be around about the time Piccadilly split frequencies and became Piccadilly Radio. I think it might have just been Piccadilly Radio on medium wave. Yeah. And so all the producers were, I think, essentially gotten rid of and absorbed into the programs department. So I ended up becoming a presenter by default, really.
Oh, really?
I think, because there was no one else to do. I'm sure there were other people to do it, but because I was on staff, they needed to find something for me to do. I can't remember exactly what the heck it was I did, but I'm pretty sure. See, I was on the launch schedule of Key 103. Again, this was, talk about out of your depth. I was doing a late night show, arts and entertainment and that kind of thing with Tony Schaefer, who was one of my great pals at the time and still is. I've not seen him for a while now. And we called the program The Business. And of course, people thinking was, it must be about business, business news and things, but no, this was as in show business. So ridiculous title for the offset. So this would be on the launch of Key 103 when it was music, not music. Yeah, and the voiceover for that was Steve Coogan.
Really? Blimey.
Yeah, Steve was dating the receptionist at Piccadilly.
Really?
Yes, and I don't think I ever met him. I don't think I did. But he did the voiceovers, and it was kind of, I'm going to try and impersonate him now. Something like Key 103, music, not music. And everyone was going, what the fuck does that mean? Music, not music. Is it music, not music? No, music, not music. Anyway, it's a complete disaster. It was trying to be, I think it was trying to be Q radio and a bit kind of yuppie to sort of distinguish itself from Piccadilly radio that was, the tried and tested and loved format. Of course, people are saying, well, why did you put that on medium wave and not on FM? I mean, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but it was back in the day where the local radio stations had to provide an alternative service, because in those days, as you know, radio stations like Viking and Piccadilly and Metro would have had an FM service and an AM service as well, AM frequencies. And so it's a sort of lose it or use it scenario. So because Radio 1, BBC Radio 1 were launching their FM transmitters across the UK in 1988, it became important for Piccadilly to be on FM. And so they opted to provide two separate services on AM, one on AM and one on FM, in order to retain both frequencies rather than run the risk of losing one. And of course, the fear was that they would lose the FM frequency and just be left with 261 or 1152, whatever it was called.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was 1988. And then I think I lasted on Key 103 the first time round. That's right. They thought, well, this is a disaster. It's awful. No one's listening. And then they put me back on Piccadilly Radio, and then that's when I started in the late night show.
Yeah.
And this is when I created the Funster.
The Funster show, yeah.
Yes. One of those things I look back with great embarrassment about.
Really?
Yeah.
What? Why?
Well, I mean, just think of the name for a start.
Yeah, but I mean, at the time, it probably didn't sit too far out of place, and people still talk about the Funster show now, Paul.
Well, yes, they do, and I'm always perplexed as to why this is. I think because Timmy Mallett was my, I suppose, my inspiration, and the person who I would have looked up to most in my early days of Piccadilly. And Timmy, of course, did the evening show. And I kind of modeled this Funster show on what Timmy was doing. I suppose it's a bit like, I don't know, elements of Steve Wright in the afternoon as well, with all the zany characters and jingles and stuff. Yeah. So I did that for, I think it was only about a year or so. And then I was back on Key 103, but doing afternoon drive. Yeah.
So
that was awful as well.
Was it?
No, it was. It was crap. It was absolute crap. I mean, I make no bones of the fact, John. I don't know how the hell I got a job in the first place, and good knows. I mean, as a producer, I was fine. I was comfortable doing that, and without blowing my own trumpet too much, I thought I was very good at that. But as a presenter, I just thought I was absolute crap. And, any tapes that I have and I listen back to, I just cringe and wince with embarrassment, but I keep them as some sort of self-flagellation.
Well, do you know, that's you saying that has really surprised me. Not that you ever came across as somebody with an ego, certainly not, but that you obviously, you were embarrassed by what you did.
Yeah, gross, very embarrassed. And it's I don't know. I then I have to remind myself. Well, look, you were only in your 20s. It was the 1980s, and people were all looked like they'd been in an explosion in a paint factory. Are all wearing day glow colors and bright red glasses and all that kind of thing. So I suppose it was definitely of its time. But then it all went tits up at Key 103 because you have to remember here, John, that this is over 40 years ago when I first started. So there's been a lot of water under the bridge. I remember Trans World under the ownership of Owen Oyston taking over Piccadilly. And I mean, people would make no secret of the fact that was the nail in the coffin for Piccadilly. That was the death knell, really. Once Piccadilly Radio floated and became Piccadilly Radio PLC and left itself wide open for takeover. So Transworld Communications with Owen Oyston, that was the beginning of the end for a few people. So, and I remember being on Key 103 and being told that I was no longer needed, and I took it terribly, really badly, even though I didn't deserve to be on air at all. And as much as Owen Oyston wouldn't have his fans, I think he was right. I shouldn't have been on in the first place. So.
But it's. I mean, that was the station that you wanted to be on. So to leave, it's hard, isn't it?
Well, it is. But the bizarre thing is, John, they didn't actually sack me. They took me off air, but they wanted me to become not head of music, but they wanted. This is when Selector was just coming in. And they wanted to, because at this stage, see, presenters were playing all their own songs. So, on the afternoon show, and every program I did, I was playing all the stuff that I wanted to play. Yeah, we'd have the A list, the B list, and the idea was that you'd have the A, B's, and C's in the studio on 7-inch vinyl. You pick from the front, put to the back, pick in the so they supposedly get some kind of even rotation, which was of absolute bollocks, because you just flick through. I'm not playing that. It's crap. Oh, I'll play that one there. So you're sort of playing all the stuff that you wanted to, really. But then they wanted to bring in RCS Selector, and of course they had no one who who knew anything about it. And they thought, because I don't know why they thought I would be any good at it, but I think it might have been. It wouldn't have been a promotion, but certainly it would have been useful had I have, bitten my tongue and swallowed my pride and actually stayed there to learn how to, to become a sort of head of music and learn what was to be the future. I'd already mentioned that I didn't really relish the thought of being on air, but by this stage, you see, I'd caught the bug. And, doing gigs and things like that, where people are coming up to you and they like what you do and you're getting a great reaction, you think, well, that's something obviously I found that I'm good at.
So during your time at Piccadilly, you must have met some celebrities, and we're not talking about we're not talking Z-list, we're talking A-list celebrities here.
That was the thing about Piccadilly, the level of guests that Piccadilly would have attracted, because, again, back in the day, people wouldn't be doing ISDN interviews. They wouldn't be doing down the lines, anything like that. If they did an interview, it was either there in the flesh in the studio, or you would go to them. I remember, for example, United International Pictures calling me to say that A Fish Called Wanda was the new film from John Cleese, and would I like to go around to his house to interview him? Wow! So I now I'd never actually seen this film at all, because it's brand new, and this interview opportunity came, and they sent me the press release, and I was reading this stuff on the train on the way down to Euston, and this car picked me up and took me around to John Cleese's house. And I was obviously in awe of the Fawlty Towers and Monty Python legend. And he was the nicest man you could meet. And I remember saying to him, what a lovely house you have, John. He said, I bought this off Brian Ferry. So not only have I been in John Cleese's house, I've been in Brian Ferry's house as well. So we chatted about Fawlty Towers and Monty Python, and he said, are we going to talk about A Fish Called Wanda? I said, I suppose we better hadn't we, really? Trying to blag my way through it. And, fortunately, he didn't suss that I hadn't seen it, or if he did, he was very kind and didn't let on that he knew that I hadn't really seen the film. But we got a nice program out of that, sort of, I suppose, a three-parter: Fawlty Towers, Python, and A Fish Called Wanda. But people coming into the radio station, I remember walking into the radio station as Charlton Heston was leaving, as Elton John was arriving. And I remember the situation with Elton John coming in for the interview. We went in the studio, and he was full of a cold. And he brought in an Asda bag with all these Kleenex tissues and lockets and cough syrups and things, and went into the studio, did the interview, and he left. And I noticed that he'd left his bag of all these goodies, and I thought, I could sell these Elton John's lockets here. How much would I get for that? But then 10 minutes later, Pat on reception called and said, Paul, Elton's in the reception for you. Has he left his cough sweets in the studio? the multimillionaire Elton John, he could have just nipped downstairs to Tully's newsagents and picked up another packet of lockets. But he came back in the studio to get his stuff. But I think one of the most surreal moments was when I was working with Timmy. And Timmy would have had all the A-list pop stars of the day in. So we're talking here sort of 83, 84, 85. I remember one occasion where George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley came in. Wake Me Up Before You Go was number one, or it had been number one. So this would be 1984, the summer of 1984. And Sony Music, I think, was the record label, and they were promoting a new upcoming artist who they wanted to get on the program. And Timmy says, well, yeah, we'll interview this guy as long as you bring in George and Andrew. thinking that the record rep would just say, yeah, well, that's not going to happen, Timmy, is it? Anyway, sure enough, George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley came along and did the interview with this young fella, who I felt sorry for, really, because people were only really interested in George and Andrew. Now, of course, Piccadilly Radio was in central Manchester, in Piccadilly Gardens, and within minutes of people hearing that George and Andrew were in the studio, Piccadilly Gardens was teeming with teenage girls. You couldn't, as far as the eye could see. And the boys were kind of a bit panicked by this. And they said to me, is there an alternative exit? Because we've walked up from street level. I said, well, I've got my car parked on the roof. I'd give you a lift if you like. And George says, would you mind? Fully expecting him to say, no, it's okay. So there we are. We're in my clapped out Ford Escort. George Michael in the passenger seat, Andrew in the back with this poor fellow whose name, to my embarrassment, I can't remember. And as we're driving down the ramp to street level, these young girls spot the boys in the car. And it's like a scene from The Beatles' A Hard Day's Night, where all these young girls start rushing to the car and they start rocking it. George, Andrew, George. And, I said, I'm sorry about this. It happens all the time. So I'm tooting the horn, get out of the way, get out of the way. And we got through the traffic lights and I said, look, I'll just spin around the block a few times just so, we lose them. And they were staying across the road there at the hotel, the Britannia Hotel. So I dropped them around the corner. And George said, that's very kind of you. He said, look, we're having a few drinks later. I think it was his 21st birthday, or it had been around about that time. He said, do you want to, you and Timmy want to pop up for a few drinks? Now, of course, I should have said, yeah, but in actual fact, I said, no, I've got to be up for work early tomorrow morning. Thanks anyway.
Oh, yeah.
So from Piccadilly, I went to a station in Stockport, KFM. Is that on your list?
Do you know what? It's not. I've got Signal 1 next. You've stumped me already, Paul. All right, so tell me about this then.
This is going to be a long, because we're only on station number 2 of 17. So KFM was the station that Carolina Hearn and Craig Cash would have been on.
Yeah.
And it was a station, a music station for Stockport. And it was an independent station, and it was, I think, just for Stockport and parts of Cheshire. Signal had just acquired it, and they wanted to make it more mainstream. I was back on doing the late night Funster show on KFM, and I got all the old gang back with me from the Piccadilly days. And then I think I was only there for about 2 or 3 months before they said, look, we're going to ship you down to Stoke-on-Trent. So the frequency that KFM were occupying, I think it was 96.9.
Was it really? Blimey.
I think it might have been. But there you go, I could be talking crap. Then it was rebranded Signal Cheshire.
Right.
So I went down to Stoke-on-Trent to do the late night Funster show on both Signal Radio and Signal Cheshire, and I think there was another station as well, Signal Stafford. So there's 3 on the Signal network, and did the late night show for a year, and this is where I would have had all the. I think the best reaction, because I kind of done it for a few years on and off. I'd kind of honed this format, and I think this is where it kind of became popular and developed a bit of a cult following. I think mainly, there's no think about it. It's definitely because of the people who I was lucky enough to be working with. There was people like Peter Morgan, who you might know. I think Simon, you're producing those, Peter. So Peter would have done all the characters for me. a lot of the characters. We had Dirty Gertie, who was one of my regulars from Manchester. The Witchfinder General telling the ghost stories at midnight, and all sorts of different people coming in to help out with the program. And it was just a free for all, it's a great time, doing that show.
I ended up doing breakfast on Signal One, and I moved from BR&B to do Signal One, and they're an interesting audience. But if you win them over, they will love you.
Now, yes, you're absolutely right. And I had 3.5 blissfully happy years in the Potteries. I absolutely adore Stoke-on-Trent and the area and Staffordshire and Cheshire. I think mainly because of the people and the reaction that I would have got. The late night show developed a cult following, not just with the kids and teenagers listening under the bedclothes, but the people who will be, working late at night. And I remember on one occasion, someone came to the door and they presented this beautiful Funster towers that they made out of the pottery thing, and they decorated it, and it was absolutely incredible. And these are obviously not kids who'd made this. And I remember I used to do lots of gigs back in those days. It was the time when karaoke became popular, right. And I was doing stuff with Colin Cook, who was again at Piccadilly, but also had been at Signal, and Colin set up his own karaoke business. So I was doing loads of gigs with Colin, and meeting people, and karaoke back in those days. You got the pissheads who would swing the microphone around and nearly have someone's eye out, but you'd also get some really good singers. It's top-notch singers who it's a bit like I suppose the forerunner of The Voice or the X Factor or something like that. So doing those karaoke gigs connected me with the audience. So I was doing those at the weekends. Then after the late night show, I was only doing that for about 9 months, I think. And then they put me onto the evening show, which obviously was squarely aimed at the hits, not homework kids thing. And did that for a year. And then onto the breakfast show. When I think they then split their frequencies. So I would be on Signal, did they call it Signal 1 or Signal FM or whatever they called it? I was on the FM thing, and then Signal Gold was their other one on the medium wave with Doug Wood. The most wonderful Doug Wood. Funny man. So, and then Peter was with me on that, Peter Morgan. He would be doing traffic and travel, but he was based up in Altrincham. I think that's where the AA Roadwatch headquarters were, and he would be doing inserts not only into my program, but maybe about half a dozen others. The BBC's services and Piccadilly and whatever it was that he was doing as well. But I involved him, doing various characters and sketches and stuff. And to my amazement, the program won a Sony Award. And I think I'm right in saying that it was the only Sony Award that Signal ever won.
Really?
I think so. I could be wrong, and I'm sure there will be someone who would come quickly and say, "Oh no, I think you'll find that John Fox won one."
No, I certainly didn't win one there. I mean, I rarely won an audience, let alone an award at Signal One. So, because you did breakfast, they put the late night Funster show on network as well.
Yes.
So you're on a group of stations.
Yeah.
And so you spent some time in Stoke, and then I never knew this. The next, we'll have to compare notes here, Paul. The next station I've got down is Viking. I didn't realise you went to Viking.
Yeah, well, from Signal again, I was sacked. There's a history here, isn't there? There's a pattern.
But it's the same for all my guests. Don't worry about that, Paul.
It's as if you're finally being seen through. You're getting away with it, and you find out that really someone sooner or later will go, "Yes, he's crap. The hell is he doing?" So, but I was a cocky arrogant little shit. And
Were you?
Honestly, I wouldn't like myself. If I met myself in the street now, I'd cross the street probably to avoid me. And I suppose I was trying to be too clever, just trying to be cocky, trying to be funny, and just out of my depth, really. I could do all the messing about the sound effects and creating scenarios and things. I've always loved the theatre of the mind, creating images with sound. And the thing that blew up in my face was when Michael Jackson was accused of what he was accused of, and with a young fella called Geordie Chandler. Now, this would be all over the front pages. And as part of the program, you look at the papers and you go through the headlines and what's reported on the front page of all the papers. And of course, it was on the front page of everything. And so I was doing the paper review, and I remember saying, well, I think this is all nonsense. I don't think any of this is true. I think what's happened here is that this lad's parents have seized an opportunity to get some money out of a rich and famous pop star. And then, just a second, there's someone at the door. The door opens. And then the introduction to one of Michael Jackson's songs, which starts off, "I just want to lean next to you for a while. Your hair is so soft. Your mouth is..." Of course, during the gaps in this, I was going, "Get off me. I'm reading all about you in the papers here, Michael." And so the record then starts and plays. And for the only time ever in my 3.5-year career at Signal, the XD rang. I thought, who's this? I thought, I picked hello, and it was John Evington, the program director.
Yeah.
His voice quivering with rage. I said, "Everything all right, John?" He said, "Look, don't you ever do anything like that ever again." I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Look, we need to have a chat. My office at 10 o'clock. So he was still, furious that I'd done this. And it basically, I went into his office and he said, I can't let that go. You're sacked, basically. Now, you see, what people don't understand, I suppose, about those times is that we had no legal training. We had no media training. And you remember of the Harold Shipman case, Preston Crown Court, where the presenters of the breakfast show on Red Rose very nearly landed a mistrial for Harold Shipman because of certain things that they said on air. And this was the catalyst. That particular instance with the Shipman case and the people on Red Rose Radio was the catalyst for presenters throughout EMAP, in fact, every broadcast outlet, to go on legal training, to be told basically what you can and cannot say. And of course, the fact that something is printed on the front page of the Sun and you repeat it on air, you say, well, it's on the front page of the Sun. I'm not saying, it's no defense. You cannot repeat an untruth or an unsubstantiated allegation. And as an arrogant little shit of a presenter, you say, well, it's free country, it's free speech, I'll say whatever I want. No, you bloody well won't, pal. You can't do it. So, that's why the people had to go on, the media training. So, I learned the hard way, and I was sacked. Not that I'd said anything defamatory, I don't think. It's probably just in very bad taste and just reacting what I thought was, a bit of a wheeze, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was fired from there, and then I went to Buzz FM in Birmingham.
Right, okay.
Which was a dance station, a very small station, but it was wonderful. It was run by a radio legend by the name of Chris Carey. himself, Spangles Muldoon on the pirate ships in the 1960s.
Yes.
So Spangles Muldoon was my boss for a few moments. And I think I did this for only a couple of months before going to Viking. But Buzz was a great radio station. It really had such a buzz about it. It was a dance station. And, the production and all that kind of stuff was just, shit hot. It was wonderful. I remember there was one voiceover that went hitting, getting, moving, grooving, shaking, quaking, having, jabbing, heels a bapping his Buzz FM.
Well, there's testing. The dealer does a lot of work in order to...
Well, I'm all for being open-minded, but I'm not all for discussing this live on air, thank you.
We are profoundly sorry.
All right, so let's move on to Viking, because you now move to Yorkshire. Of course, I'm a whole lad, so I'd say the real part of Yorkshire. And you do afternoons on Viking.
I obviously, because I was out of work, I was sending tapes off left, right, and centre. And Steve King asked me over for a chat. We met in Manchester, I think, and he was saying about the Metro Radio Group, and they got all these radio stations, and they're looking for someone at Viking FM. And I thought, I wonder if it's the breakfast show, because I just picked up the Sony Award for the breakfast show. But no, it was for afternoons. And I had a wonderful time at Viking. Great show to do, isn't it? You of all people, John, know the benefits of being on afternoons, given the social life of Viking. Where the Dick and Pussy was Studio 3.
Paul, I feel that I think Joel Ross might have explained the D&P, but again, we should just point out that that's the name of the club, the Whittingham and Cat.
Sorry, I forget about that. It's terribly remiss of me. I apologise. It just occurred to me that there's a double entendre there. Yes, the Wheatington and Cat was given the name the Dick and Pussy by probably everyone who ever frequented it. And that became sort of Studio 3, really. And I just remember, as soon as the program finished, piling on into the DMP, where there'd be people like Simon Logan would have been on breakfast, Trevor James on drive, Derek Flood, Del Boy, hey, was on mid-morning, me on the afternoons. And it was a great time, a great crack with everybody. But, Simon was on breakfast, and I'm sure he did most of the programs, 3 sheets to the wind. And I just remember, I remember covering for him. He went on holiday for whatever it was, a week. And Paul Hogan was on with me doing traffic and travel. And I just remember, I was still hungover. I was throwing up in the bin in the corner of the studio. I was that hungover doing the breakfast show. But that was the life there. I remember, my waistline was 28 inches when I started at Viking. Within a year, it was 32 inches, which just filled out considerably more even, a few years later. But a great crack. Even, those days. Viking, I think Viking and Piccadilly were probably the places that I had the most fun.
The next move's really interesting because you moved to Minster FM. You do breakfast, but you also become the gaffer, Paul.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if you ever had these feelings, John, of this can't last. This can't last. And of course, because of what I mentioned before, this history of someone sacking me on what seemed to be a regular basis. I thought, well, if I'm the boss, I'll just sack myself if I don't like the show one day. So I was thinking of the future and thinking, what will I do? Because I can't continue being a presenter ad infinitum. And I thought, well, I'll try my hand at radio management. A friend of mine, Nigel Reed, who I knew at Signal, he was the sales director, and he'd gone to Minster as sales director, and we'd kind of met up frequently. And whilst I was still at Viking, and he said Tony Fisher, who was the program director at at Minster was leaving, and would I be interested? So I met up with John Darch, who was the managing director, and I got the gig basically. But it was wonderful because I was interviewed by Richard Whiteley.
Of course, I mean Richard Whiteley, he was the mayor of Wetwang, wasn't he?
That's right. Yes. Wetwang Weekend Television. So yes. Do you know Chris Johnson?
No, I don't know. Oh no, I do know Chris Johnson. Forgive me, I do know Chris. Yeah. Chris
is the funniest man you will ever meet, and is someone who I would heartily recommend that you got on your podcast. He's a naturally gifted, funny man, very, very funny lad. But anyway, yes. So Richard was the mayor of Wetwang. So I spent only a brief time at Minster for the reason you pointed out, really, I suppose. I was the breakfast show presenter and program controller as well. And basically it was bloody killing me. Doing, so I'd be up at whatever, 5 to 6. To be on air at 6. And then in the office until sort of 6, 7 at night. And, it was a great time. A good time. But and then I got a call from Steve King, who'd given me the job at Viking. He said, "How's things going?" I said, "Well, apart from being knackered, I'm okay." He said, "Would you be interested in joining us at the Pulse? We're looking for a breakfast show presenter." And I think it was Elliot who was doing the program at the time, and he was going on to maybe BR&B or somewhere. And so I thought, just doing a show and go. Yes, I'll meet up with you, and that would be great. I met up with Steve and Steve Martin, who was the program controller at the Pulse, and got the gig. But it didn't go well at all. I mean, it was awful. Awful.
Why was that?
My domestic life at this time wasn't great. And the young lady who I was living with at the time was very jealous, and I was co-presenting the Pulse Breakfast Show with the wonderful Debbie Linley. Now, because Debbie is a lady, then it was automatically assumed by my partner at the time that I would be having an affair with her. And so even before I'd started, she had already convinced herself that we were getting bouncy with each other. Which wasn't the truth at all. There's nothing, and so I was getting in the neck from her. So it was just I was on a hiding to nothing, really, John. It was just an awful time. Steve Martin, I think, realised that he made a mistake in hiring me, because on air it wasn't good. It was. Let's be honest. It was crap. It was awful. And then I saw a notice on the notice board: program controller vacancy, Great Yorkshire Gold. And I'd only been at the Pulse for 3 months, if that. And I saw this as my exit. So I applied for this. And again, met up with Steve King and Mick Johnson, who I'd met many years before at Metro, and I did the ill-fated overnight demo at Metro Radio.
Yeah.
Met with Mick and Steve, and again, I got the gig. And again, another bit of a poison chalice, in that my domestic situation hadn't improved, because it was a big gig, being a program controller within the Metro Radio group. I wasn't on air, and so I was in charge of these disparate egos. And again, that wasn't a particularly happy time. The station was hugely successful, thanks mainly to a wonderful guy called Steve Parkinson, who would be my predecessor, who was my predecessor, rather. I took over and inherited a great radio station, and I put my own stamp on it, and we had some great audience figures. And I remember Dee Ford, who was the MD, I think, of Hallam FM, because Great Yorkshire Gold would be based in Sheffield. And I remember her being amazed that the figures were so good, and she couldn't understand why the listening hours were 19.7. Average hours 19.7, which is unheard of, apart from radio stations in, say, Guernsey or Jersey or somewhere, like that, where you've obviously you would expect a great listenership. But of course, once EMAP took over the Metro Radio Group, again, it was a high. It's just a question of time before they decided to dispense with my services. Which is a shame, really, because, Great Yorkshire Gold was a terrific radio station, but EMAP were terribly embarrassed because it was listened to by old people. And they don't want old people listening. They just want the young, funky trendies who are going to spend money. And so they closed down Great Yorkshire Gold and launched Magic. The Big Easy. The Big Easy. Do you remember that, John?
Well, I do. Well, this is where our careers kind of meet, because... Do you then move on to Magic 1161 from there? No. So I then go back to because they got rid of me at Great Yorkshire Gold as the program director there, and then went through not a good time personally. I was suffering from depression and all those kinds of things. And I managed to get some overnight shifts at Metro. And also Heart in Birmingham. Right.
So I was living in Stamford Bridge near York at this time. So I was driving up to do an overnight show at Metro. And then I remember driving from Metro down to Birmingham to do maybe a Saturday afternoon show.
Wow.
And then I was doing this sort of loop, and doing overnights at Heart as well. And I remember they used to have a thing called the 30-minute non-stop music marathon or something like that.
Yeah.
So I used to use this opportunity to have a kip outside on the settee. Until the inevitable, until one day, the silence detector. And, I'd overslept by about an hour and a half. Well, that was a funny situation because a guy called Paul Fairburn ran Heart, and he was a nice fella. But I remember John Myers recommending me to Paul to take over the breakfast show at Radio Air. And this was just after the Sony thing at Signal, and I think I might have still been at Signal, or I might have, whatever it was anyway. But Paul Fairburn called me and said, we're looking for a breakfast show presenter at Radio Air. Your name has come highly recommended from John Myers. And I said, oh, that's very kind of him. I'd known John. I'd met him a few times, and we got on well. I think he'd offer me a job at Red Rose when I was still at Signal, and I turned him down. Because I was on breakfast, but he wanted me to come and do evenings, and I kind of thought it was a bit of a backward step, really. But we kept in touch when he went up to CFM in Carlisle, and so I got the call from Paul, and he said, "Do you have a tape?" I said, "Well, I've got the one that I would have sent to John." And he said, "Okay, you send it." So I sent it to him, and then a few days later, he called and said, "Just to let you know, we won't be taking this any further." I said, "Oh, okay, fair enough. Is there any particular reason why?" He said, "Well, your vowel sounds are very northern." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, you say bath and path." I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Well, I want my presenters to say bath and path."
Good Lord.
I said, "Well, in Leeds? I don't think anyone speaks like that in Leeds." But anyway, so that didn't come to anything. And then, the getting the phone call from Paul, I'd sent him a tape in desperation, I think, because I was out of work after what happened at Great Yorkshire Gold. And he called. He said, "Paul, I think we've spoken before, haven't we?" I said, "Yes, we have. You remember?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Have you started speaking properly yet?"
You're joking.
He said, "I still need people to say bath and path." I said, "Well, I suppose I could do it. I'll have a go." And he said, "Well, look, no, seriously." He said, I don't think that we can offer you anything." And my heart sank, literally, heart sank. And then about half an hour later, he called and said, "Ignore what I've just said. Can you do a few overnights for us?" So I did, and I still said Bath and Bath.
It was a technical problem. You heard something on air you shouldn't have done.
Oh, yeah.
So from heart, doing just the odd stuff. You remember a wonderful guy called Tim Gibson, who was very, involved in Viking back in the early days. But also Tim had a business called Adventures in Radio. And Tim would have been the guy who used to take people all over the world to do programs from, say, Disney or Australia, whatever it was. And people go on a bender, on a freebie, to do their program. Yeah. And Tim and I were very good friends. And he called me and said, "There's GWR are relaunching their Classic Gold service, their AM service, and they're going to rebrand it as Classic Gold. They're looking for a head of music, and I've put your name forward." So I met up with Jana Rangooni, a wonderful New Zealand lady who was the program director, and got on with her, and she gave me the job of head of music, but also evening show presenter as well. Now, Classic Gold was a network of all the AM radio stations, or AM services that GWR would have had. So I think there was about, say 10 radio stations in all. And Classic Gold was made up of the old Radio 1 brigade. So we had DLT, Paul Burnett, Simon Bates, Mike Reed was on there, David Hamilton doing bits and bobs as well. So, for me, who grew up listening to Radio 1, this was working with my boyhood heroes here. So I did that for a while. Then I ended up in hospital. Right. So not as a result of working at Classic Gold, but as a result of a ski injury that I sustained, and I had to have knee reconstruction surgery. And so I ended up in Stoke Mandeville Hospital, and I had this surgery done, but I still had my house in York. And I said to Jana, would it be possible if I had a studio built in my garage in York that I could do the programs for Classic Gold whilst convalescing? So, I wouldn't be able to drive or even walk for 3 months. And she agreed. Despite all the criticisms leveled at GWR, they were very forward thinking in terms of technology. I suppose that would be a double-edged thing in a way, because of course, they were the forerunners of networking. Yeah. And so lots of people would have lost their jobs as a result of all this networking, which obviously not a good thing. So I had this studio built at my house, and then I think they might have just launched Magic 1161. Nick Wright was doing the breakfast show, and they were looking for someone to do weekend breakfast. So in addition to doing Classic Gold evenings, I was doing weekend breakfast on Magic 1161. So, it's burning the candle at both ends.
I was going to say, incredible. And were you doing initially Magic 1161? Was that from your garage in York?
Yeah, no, I didn't do that from the garage. I was driving into to Hull to do that. Despite everything, I don't think the technology was in place in those days. So we're talking, is he referring to his CV? I think that would be about 1999 when I was doing Magic as well.
So what you doing weekends? So I always remember you doing breakfast on Magic 1161.
Yeah, I did. And so Nick Wright, I think was it Steve Jordan? No, Steve Jordan was doing breakfast after Nick Wright left, I think. And Steve left to go to one of the John Myers stations in Nottingham, and I forget what it was called now.
I think Century. Was it Century? That was it. Yeah.
No, it was Century. I think it was. And so I got the gig there on breakfast, and I can't remember who the program director was. I think it might have been Andrew Robson, who lived just around the corner from me.
Yeah.
A wonderful man, and one of my best friends back in the day. So yeah, I got the full-time breakfast gig, and I was doing. So then I was only doing weekends on Classic Gold. So the tables are sort of reversed, I suppose. It's full-time at Magic 1161, but just part-time then at Classic Gold. But also, you see, I don't know if you got this one. Have you got the Minster network on your list there?
We haven't.
The only reason I've had to write all these down, John.
Yeah, but do you know what it is, Paul? I'm being genuinely honest here. It's because you haven't got an ego, and there isn't a website at paulcarrington.com that we could find, certainly, where you list all your stations.
No, there isn't. And, you try to keep it secret, mainly to avoid the inland revenue.
Can I just want to talk about when I first started at Viking, and you were doing breakfast on Magic 1161, and there was some incredible presenters there, and I was in awe of all of you because I'd listened to both stations, growing up, and I remember walking in, and they used to alternate, so it was Viking and Magic on in the reception, and you were on breakfast, and it's difficult to talk about this because we're talking about a disgraced person that not many people talk about anymore. But you can do, or you did, the ultimate impression of that said person. I think we all know who we're talking about.
Yes.
And I was in the reception, and I was listening to your show, and it would, as a listener, it was as if this disgraced person was on the telephone and you were talking to him. And I remember saying to somebody in the office, how is he doing that if he hasn't got the actual person on the phone? And it was because you had this skill where you would interview said disgraced person on the phone. You'd put the phone down, put the mic up, do yourself, and then go back to the it was just incredible, Paul.
Yeah. Well, thank you, John. And I'd forgotten all about that technique, and it's one that I used quite regularly, not just for this said disgraced person. So we can use another alternative. Let's say Dame Edna Everidge. Yeah. So I'd and this is back in the day where there was no delay on the phones, so you could speak in real time and not have any kind of delay effect. So yeah, I would. I'd phone myself up on the studio, XD, and I'd put myself through to the desk with the phone fader up, but I would ride the mic fader and have conversations with myself, depending on who this person was that I was pretending to be. So it would be, say, hello, darling, it's Damon Everidge here. Hello, Paul, darling. Damon, but yes, I remember I was quite pleased with that little trick.
Paul, genuinely, I was blown away by that. I thought it was just incredible. So I've never forgotten it to this day. I always tell people about Paul Carrington, you, of course, doing this technique, and everyone's like, "That's incredible! It's brilliant."
Yeah, I was quite pleased with that one because I don't think unlike everything else in my career, I don't think I'd stolen that from anyone else. I think that was original to me for doing that, but someone else is probably going to come forward and say, "No, I think you'll find that such and such somebody did it before you."
Well, I mean, I certainly tried to steal it, but it is difficult to do. It sounds a lot easier than it actually is.
It is. So, I remember when I was at Radio Leeds, and Joe Maiden, who was the gardener, he was a huge fan of Dame Edna Everidge, and I used to do the Sunday morning. That's right. Joe and Tim would have been on doing the gardening program. So Tim was the presenter, Joe was the gardening expert, and we'd do a little two-way just to say what's coming up on the program after 11 o'clock today. And of course, it was the request show, and I used to do the voices and impressions for them. And Joe says, "How's my friend Dame Edna?" "Well, let's get her on the phone, shall we, Joe?" Having this sort of three-way conversation. This look on his face is, "How the hell are you doing that?"
I love it. This is a pure skill. So then, look, we'll move on, Paul, because you go to Magic in Leeds. You do breakfast there.
Yeah, Leeds, one of my favourite cities. I love Leeds.
You take over the breakfast show after the the sad passing of Peter Tate as well. So
yes, no, they were big shoes to fill. Now Stuart Baldwin, who was,
Yes.
were you there when?
Yeah, he was my first ever. Well, Andy Robson was my first boss, but he never spoke to me. So Stuart was his deputy, and he was great.
No, Andy. He obviously liked you if he didn't speak to you. Do you remember Dalit that we used to have, the playout system?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
I remember Dalit running on an old compact 486, which was as slow as an asthmatic snail. It was, but you'd press a button on the keyboard, and then you'd have to wait 4 or 5 years for the keyboard, the computer to respond to your request. And I was having none of this, and I was thinking, oh, for fuck's sake, what crap have they given us here? And I just remember we were doing a thing called Don't Say Hello on Magic 1161. And there was a big box in the studio with all the entries. And I just had one of my rants. And I ended up kicking this box of the Don't Say Hello entries. And all these entries just flew up in the air and started, falling like snowflakes, ever so gently, down to the ground, just as Robson came into the studio door and he opened the door, and he said, "Everything all right?" No, and he was turned and walked away. I will see you later. So yes, if Andrew didn't speak to you, he liked you.
Oh, that's good to know. Although when I was working at the BBC before I quit radio, I went on a training course, and there he was, 23 years on, his face looking at me, and I said, "Andy, you're going to have to speak to me now." I will.
Hi, how are you? How are you, Tom? So Andrew would have been the program director, and then Stuart took over. So Stuart then went to Radio Air as the program director. So I would still be on Magic 1161 at this stage. And Stuart called and said, "You've heard about Peter?" And I said, "Yes." "It's terrible, isn't it?" He said, "Yeah. Do you want to meet up?" So we met up, and in fact, it was on the day of Peter's funeral that we met up. And I said, "This is slightly inappropriate, Stuart, isn't it?" He said, "Well, not really." He said, "Because we can meet up without anyone seeing, because obviously people were at Peter's funeral paying their respects." He said, "I'd like to offer you the job of Peter's replacement." Now, Peter hadn't been on air, I think, maybe for about a year. He was terribly ill and had a brain tumor. And I said, "Well, I wouldn't feel comfortable about this, Stuart, if I'm honest with you." I said, "People would be accusing me of, being opportunistic, of, filling a dead man's shoes, essentially."
Yeah.
And he said, "Look, Paul," he said, "life goes on." He said, "Someone is going to get the gig, and I'd like it to be you." I said, "Think about it, and let's chat further if it is something that we can move forward on." So I kind of thought about it, and then thought, well, yeah, you're right. And he was saying, Peter's not been on air for such a while, and it's not as though he's been sacked or anything like that. So anyway, I took over, and I had the best time there in Leeds at Magic 828. It was a wonderful station, and I think we either vied for popularity between Magic and the other one, Radio Air.
Radio Air, yeah.
And I think at one point Magic 828 beat Radio Air in terms of audience figures. And again, I'm sure someone come and correct me.
No, I think you'll find a previous guest on Crunch and Roll, Warren Moore, who's at Radio Air, I believe.
Warren, yes, wonderful Warren.
Yeah, he's a top man, but he talked about the quite depressing time when AM took over FM. So you're right, yeah. And that was you, was it, Paul?
No. To be fair, I'm not sure. I wouldn't lay claim to any glory in that respect. But I know that Pete certainly. Peter was hugely popular and did a great show. Magic 828, of course, was the heritage station in terms of the Magic Network. Bear in mind that Viking, it was Great Yorkshire Gold before becoming Magic. Magic 828 had always been Magic 828 since the split of radio air, their AM and FM frequencies. And so it was a well-established and much-loved station. But then they tried to destroy it again by just making it the Big Easy. And it was not a good move as far as I would be concerned. But but so I took over, and I think at this stage we might have gone back to being more of a greatest hits format rather than let's slash your wrists and send you all to sleep format. I did breakfast for 5 years, and it was a wonderful station. Great, you talk about the people, for example, in Stoke-on-Trent, and how connected and how much love the station is, and it was absolutely adored. And I remember we used to have listener nights, and I remember one occasion where we had a very good relationship with GNER, the rail network. And they laid on a train for us, just a train just for the Magic 828 listeners. We took the listeners to London. So we had our very own train. How many radio stations could boast that?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
I do want to talk about the next move, because you for the first time, I believe, you moved to the dark side and you go and work for the BBC, Paul.
Now, Stuart had moved on by this stage. No, he hadn't. Stuart was still there. And we had an MD who took over, and we didn't get on.
Right, okay.
We didn't see eye to eye at all, and this person made it very clear that this person thought that I was crap, basically. And even though the audience figures were consistently good, there was I don't know what it was. There was clearly a personality clash. Stuart remained supportive, and we had a great working relationship with Stuart, and but then Phil Roberts. I don't know if you know the name Phil Roberts.
I do, yeah.
Phil, I would have known from his days at MFM, March of Sound, and Phil got the job of editor. They call him at the BBC. So he's the editor, program controller, if you like, at BBC Radio Leeds. And I just dropped Phil a line one day to say, congratulations on the gig. Fantastic news. Well done. And he replied saying, let's meet up for lunch. I'll show you around the new building, because they just moved to this posh new building. And I met up with him, and he gave me the guided tour, and he said, you'd really like it here. I said, "Oh, I'm not after a job," said he, lying through his teeth. He said, "No, you'd love it here," because they were trying to change from being sort of radio for about lost dogs and people on the phone moaning about cracks in the pavement to making it more of a sort of commercial radio entertainment format. So he said, "Well, look, you have a think. If you want to join us, I'd be very interested in talking to you." And so I had a little think, and I thought, well, the BBC, it's the BBC. They're not going to come, knocking every day. And so I called him and said, "Were you serious about what you were saying?" He said, "Yeah, absolutely. Are you interested?" I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." He said, "What show do you want?" I said, "Well, what's on offer?" So he said, "Well, we're looking at making changes to the afternoons." And I said, "Well, that would suit me after getting up at 3:30 in the morning all these years." And so I remember saying to Stuart Baldwin, and he said, "It's contract renewal time soon. We just need to talk about your new contract." And I said, He said, assuming that you want to sign with us, I said, well, I've had a call from the BBC. So anyway, I think I had another 3 months to run on the contract, and so after the contract ran out, I joined BBC Radio Leeds. In the meantime, Phil had been promoted to, I think he went over to Liverpool. So even before I started at Radio Leeds, Phil had buggered off. Helen Thomas, who was the HLRP, in other words, the head of regions for the BBC Yorkshire, called me and said, look, whatever you've agreed with Phil, it's all still, all systems go as far as we're concerned. Now, the funny thing is, Helen used to read the news for me on Minster FM.
Oh, wow.
But she used to drive into Leeds to do the bulletin from Yorkshire Television, because we had a contract with Yorkshire Television to supply the news. And then when this was coming up to an end, I said to her, "What about if we created a head of news position for you at Minster in Dunnington?" And she was living literally just 2 or 3 minutes drive away, and so it's a bit of a no-brainer for her to say, "Well, yeah, absolutely." So one of my claims to fame, that giving Helen Thomas her job there at Minster FM. So Helen called me and said, "Look, this is all still, whatever you agree with Phil is fine. It's going to go ahead." Blah 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 blah. So then I met up with the Phil. It wouldn't be his replacement, because I think he was just acting editor. And I remember being introduced to my producer, Katie, who is wonderful. I absolutely adore her, and she is one of my best friends. And we got on like a house on fire. But I remember this guy saying, the three of us need to meet up to talk about the program. And he just looked at me and said, "So what can a commercial radio disc jockey bring to the BBC?" I thought, oh, here we go. Head up your own fucking arse. And so, he made it very clear with just those, that comment that I wasn't what he was looking for at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So during my short stay at Radio Leeds, I think I was only there for about 5 years. Can't remember now. I might not even been that. I think I worked for 5 or 6 different editors. Yeah. 3 hated me, 2 loved me. And unfortunately, at contract renewal time, the one who hated me said, "We're not going to take this any further." Because I think the BBC were coming under scrutiny to make cost cuts and everything. And even though the audience figures were good, you see, when Phil hired me, Phil Roberts, he gave me the option of going on staff or being a contract service provider. So what you used to have to do, you'd have to set up your own limited company as a production company and supply yourself as the product. And of course, because I was doing Asda FM live as well. You
were, yes, which arguably is probably the biggest radio station in the country. But yeah,
it was, and because I didn't want to lose the Asda FM gig, I said, well, I prefer not to go on staff. And of course, if I'd have gone on staff, then I might even still be there now. I'm not quite sure if that would be a good thing. So I ended up only a few years there at the BBC, which was a shame because, as I said, the program seemed to be very popular, and the person who released me, wouldn't renew my contract, was making the excuses that they needed to make cutbacks and I remember her saying, "I want my afternoon show to be. I just imagine myself curling up on the sofa with a latte." I think, this is Leeds, for Christ's sake. Who listens to this radio station? These people who you're fabricating it, they do not exist. I know who the audience is. They're not the 20-something metropolitan types. They are the salt of the earth. They are the people who, they're over 50s and they absolutely love this radio station. They don't have a plasma television in every single room in the house. They don't curl up for a latte and read The Guardian. So anyway, we didn't get on. We didn't see eye to eye. So then from BBC Radio Leeds, it was back into commercial radio to Pulse 2 in Bradford.
And I mean, Pulse 2, Pulse 1, both fantastic radio stations. Did you enjoy your time? Because you were there for some time. Pulse 2.
To be fair, Pulse 2 I absolutely adored. And there was some wonderful people like Jackie Blay, Chris Johnson, Milo, of course, would be later on FM. Paul Foster was there. Debbie Linley would be on Breakfast with Paul when I was on Breakfast on Pulse 2. Yeah, and I think I did Breakfast for just maybe 2 or 3 years. And then I was still living in Malton. And so the drive from Malton over to Bradford, it meant that I was getting up at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. And I remember, so many occasions, I was the one who was clearing the path for the snowplow, the depths of winter. And thinking, what's that orange light flashing behind me as I'm going down the A64, thinking, where is the road? I'm sure there used to be a road here. And it was the snowplow, beckoning me to get out of the way. So yeah, and then my sort of last stint at Pulse 2 was doing afternoons, and again the Pulse 2 audience were the same as the BBC Radio Leeds and Magic 828 audience in that they are the salt of the earth and they will buy into what you're doing. And I got a great reaction from the listeners at Pulse 2 because I tried to make stars out of the people who were listening. And, I just, what it's like, John, you're right. When I think first started, we didn't have the facility to record phone calls off air, so, and I remember, I think it was Magic 828 was the first station that I could do this on. We couldn't do it at Magic 1161, I don't think. Certainly none of the previous stations. And so I'd set Cool Edit Pro recording from 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'd just been answering the phones and just chit chatting to people. And some of the stuff that they were coming out with was radio gold. And I'd just put this stuff on air, I'd clip 30 seconds of it and just pop it out. Who's calling us this morning? Hello, I am Paul. And they'd come up with this random, I've just got my head stuck in the freezer. Sorry, Paul. And there's all this random stuff. And so I loved the interaction with the listeners on Pulse 2 especially, and Magic 828. BBC Radio Leeds, you're protected from the great unwashed, in that, of course, you have the producer who would field all the calls.
Yeah.
And then they put you the caller through on air, and the moment was gone. Because they'd said what they had to say to the producer, and so it's very diluted. They end up saying things like, "As I was just saying to your producer, no, I wanted you to say that to me." Yeah. So
I know exactly what you mean. I know exactly. And now you're in Ireland. You've moved to Ireland.
Yes, relocated. So back in I think mid 2016, I saw, not the writing on the wall as such, but I saw that radio was going in a direction that I didn't feel I would be part of the journey, I suppose, really. And it became apparent that social media was the all important thing, and whatever came out of the loudspeaker was playing second fiddle to social media. And I thought, well, this is not what I got into radio for. I didn't get into radio to do social media, and and I know that sounds like a sort of an old has-been or whatever. And I still maintain that people listen to the radio for entertainment, and social media is a useful tool. It's not the be-all and end-all. So I kind of decided I had to sack myself. I said to Tony Mackenzie, how much notice do I need to give? And he said, what do you mean notice? I said, well, I'm going to be moving to Ireland. because the boys had grown up and we were kind of at that sort of crossroads of what shall we do now? And I wasn't happy for the last few months of being at Pulse 2. I loved the program, but it was just playing second fiddle really to Pulse 1 as well. And he said, "Well, what's your contract?" I said, "Well, I don't have a contract." I said, "You don't have a contract?" I said, "No, I didn't sign it." "Oh, well, when do you want to go?" I said, "Well, 3 months, is that okay?" "Yeah, you sure?" So I ended up doing a 3 months notice period. Did you like my Tony McKenzie impression there? It sounded more like... It sounded a bit more like Roland Rhett, didn't it, Rhett fans? So I finished at Pulse 2, and then Caroline and I, my wife, we set about the task of finding somewhere in Ireland to live, because Caroline is Irish. Now we'd been coming over, several times a year for many years, and I love it in Ireland. It's a wonderful place and lovely people. I said, I'd love it. So we made the move, and I remember chatting to Roy Martin, and Stuart. And Stuart says to me, "So are you going to be doing any radio when you go to Ireland?" I said, "I wouldn't have thought so. I wouldn't have thought that an English voice would go down terribly well on an Irish radio station." They said, "Oh, well, there's a few people. Speak to Roy." So I got in touch with Roy, and Roy says, "Well, where are you moving to?" I said, "County Roscommon." He said, "Oh, yes, that's the station called Shannonside over there. I'll introduce you to the program director, Martin Howard."
Amazing.
So within minutes, Martin was messaging me, "When are you moving over?" So let me know when you're over and we'll meet up. So we spent a few months renovating the house that we're living in. And then I met up with him, and we got on like a house on fire. And that was February 2017 when I first started at Shannonside. And I present the Country and Irish music show, which is an English gobshite presenting Irish and country music. See, country and Irish, John, is a genre of music. It's country music with Irish people.
Okay.
So it is the most popular music format in Ireland. Country music is huge over here.
Do you know what, Paul? We've been talking for an hour and a half
Too long
now.
I'm sorry about this. You need to edit this. Terrible.
No, Paul. Honestly, I've sat here and just and listened to the professor talk about his career, and it genuinely it's been wonderful. And I just wondered. What's it like talking about the 40 years that you've been doing radio?
When you first started, how long did you think it would last?
Me personally,
yeah.
Well, I just lived my whole career thinking I'm going to get sacked the next week.
Exactly. And I think most of us do. And, and I think that's a good way to be. And I think that in a way, if you are a freelance presenter rather than a staff person, it keeps you hungry. It keeps you on top of your game, because you think, well, what's going to happen? You just try and be the best that you possibly can be all the time in the hope that your contract is going to be renewed. So when I started at Piccadilly, I didn't imagine that that I'd be there for whatever it was, 8-9 years. I didn't think that it would lead to doing afternoon drive on Key 103. And I didn't think that it would lead to this Funster creation that people still get in touch with me about today, about the ghost stories and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I kind of look back and think how lucky I was to get away with doing what I did with so little talent. And I think the old adage, it's who you know, it's what you know, blah 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 blah, and it's 99% luck but 1% talent. And I think that I've had so much luck, which has more than compensated for any lack of talent. I've always been one of these people, John, whose enthusiasm far outweighs his abilities. If someone says you can't do something, I'll try extra hard to prove them wrong. You know, at school, for example, I was always the one who would have to try just a little bit harder than everyone else just to keep up. So, yeah, I would look back and say how lucky and fortunate I was, and still to be on air, doing it in a foreign country, and the audience figures continue to rise. I was given an award a few months ago for outstanding contribution to Irish country music.
Amazing.
So I seem to have been embraced, or certainly accepted anyway, into the culture over here. And it's you know, the people are wonderful, and it's a terrific radio station to work for, and it reminds me a lot of commercial radio. Back in, you know, when I first started. In fact, it's rather like coming full circle in that we used to call them full service radio stations, the Vikings, the Piccadillys, the Metros, the Radio Airs, in that there was something for everyone. You know, you weren't just a pop music station. You know, you'd have specialist music, you'd have magazine shows, you'd have news programs, you'd have talk shows, and that's what it is at Shannon Side Northern Sound. You know, there's the talk show, the pop show, playing the current hits of the day, and you know, me doing the Irish and country music show, which you know, it's good crack.
Crack, I love it. I don't love crack because that sounds wrong, but I was on about the Irish sector. Well, look, do you know, Paul? Thank you so much for being on Crunch and Roll. I genuinely, it's been incredible to be in your company for this amount of time. I don't think we've ever really sat down and talked about your career, you know, as we have done. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I always ask my guests, you know, who would you like to hear on an episode of Crunch and Roll from our industry?
Well, there are so many. You know, say for example, Timmy Mallett, who would be my inspiration back in the Piccadilly days, but also Phil Wood, who is another Piccadilly legend, who is the single most creative person I've ever had the privilege to work with. You know, people like say Chris Johnson, and in more recent times, Chris would be such a great guest. You know, he's such a funny guy. But you know, there are looking at the sort of 17 radio stations that I've worked for, and that's not including the kind of the occasional freelance bits as well. You know, it would be impossible to mention every single person, but those would be a few people.
Bless you, Paul. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, John. You've been listening to Crunch and Roll with me, Paul Carrington. Subscribe on your favourite podcast app to get every new episode as soon as they drop. Crunch and Roll is a 969 media production presented by John Fox and produced by Simon Bozowski.
Great job with the surname, Paul. Well done.
Oh, yeah.